Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guest today is Anish Patel. He's the head of Federal at Cloudflare. Mr. Patel, good to have you with us.
Hey, happy to be here.
And let's begin, before we get to the main topic, which is this idea of distributed cloud instances. Maybe it's useful to understand the evolution that federal agencies, really all large organizations, have gone through from when they were data center owned, operated by the government, to what we have now, these hybrid environments with multi-cloud of commercial cloud providers.
Yeah, it's an excellent place to start. So I think certainly if we look back at the first generation of services that were provided across the internet, generally most agencies had their own data center services. And a lot of times it was government-owned facilities, government-owned people that were managing and operating those systems. Over time, 20 years ago, the concept of public cloud came about, and that was revolutionary at the time, right? Ultimately, it allowed IT to get out of that business, or government to get out of that business of delivering IT services and managing data centers wherever possible, not exclusively, but wherever possible. And so this allowed this move from this on-prem data center to a public cloud data center. But essentially, you're moving from one house to another, right? And that new house had maybe some better facilities, it allowed some level of innovation, and that was great for the last 20 years. If we look at the evolution of what's happening next and type of services, and it's we might as well go ahead and get the AI buzzword out there. If we think about the next generation of services that are going to rely on AI, there's really a need for kind of a new architecture in that. And so how does that public cloud architecture evolve? That's a large part of what Cloudflare has been building for the last 15 years.
And what is it about AI that requires this new architecture? Simply that it demands so much more processing power and resources?
So ultimately, there's, AI is really the first thing since the development of the computer that's been kind of revolutionary on that compute scale, right? And so if we think about internet and the capabilities of a network, that has to match what is needed from the compute cycles of AI today. That's really the kind of blending that we have to be able to do as industry and as agencies. And so if I think about, just kind of thinking about the evolution of the internet, right? You had kind of first generation of the internet was basically you were taking something physical and digitizing it. You had a magazine, you made it digital. And then you had like the advent of this social media and smartphones and 5G networks or 4G networks. And all of that combined to essentially give you this kind of new experience that was exclusively like digital, right? And now that has evolved. And if we think about what AI brings to the table, when we think about AI or crypto or post-quantum crypto and what that means for the industry and blockchain, et cetera, all these like newer technologies, well, individually, they didn't always make sense to the masses. But when you combine all those things, now thinking about the speed of interaction and how reliant you are on a network that's trusted and reliable becomes really critical. So if you can bring both that compute and that internet power as close to the end user as possible, that's game changing for where the internet and the AI applications are going.
Yeah, so it's AI in the sense you need the processing power, but it's also AI then in what it is you are delivering to end users. The digital experience, if you will, and I guess for that matter, the experience you're delivering to your own employees, your own people that are also everywhere, not just the external stakeholders.
Yeah, that's a good way to break it down. So ultimately, there are kind of two parts to this. There's the public view and then the employee view. So for the public view, really the digital service is the agency today, right? If you think about how people interact with an agency, maybe a decade, two decades ago, you would expect if you needed to renew your driver's license or your passport, you're going to go into a government building and probably wait there for hours, if not many, many hours, right? And that was expected. You didn't love it, but you knew that that's what had to be done. If you think about the last couple of years, anybody that's renewed a driver's license is actually quite improved experience. You can do a lot of it online, sometimes all of it online, right? And so that's the baseline of today. But the evolution of where that's going, we as an IT organization within the agencies and as an industry have to be ready for what's coming next. And what's coming next isn't just the digital services are generally available, and when it's not, you can pick up the phone or go into an office. It's just going to be expected that all services are digital and that service has an uptime and reliability and trust level that's greater than TikTok and Twitter, right? And so that's, I think, really where we have to go, is that even if services have been digitized to a large extent today, how they've been digitized has generally been, hey, you took something from your old house and you moved it to your new house, right? Your data center to the public cloud, and you modernized and you rebuilt that application to be modern, but there is a new generation of like architectural thinking that has to come along with a distributed architecture, and that's what the world is evolving to here in the next few years.
And the idea of the distributed architecture, is that simply for response times?
Yes, there's I think a couple of things that come into play, right? And so whether it's for, yes, the latency and the performance matters, but why? Like ultimately, if you think about the email as an example of just a very simple case, well, that doesn't need to have like low latency. You don't necessarily know that an email was sent and you got it in 2 seconds or 2 minutes later, right? But there are different mediums that matter. And so I think a good analogy would be thinking about like what Google did to the search space, 15, 20 years ago, right? Before, when you had to search for something and you went and asked Jeeves, well, you were waiting for a few seconds, right? And that was kind of expected until it wasn't. When Google was like, hey, you could actually search for something and instantly, before you blink an eye, get those search results, that became the standard. And so if we think about what that means for AI today, I think, in the next few years, people will look back at this phase of like generative AI and how we leverage AI and probably be like, well, why did we have so much patience with AI? Because if you're communicating, right, if you're using the typical chatbot application that's like available to the masses, well, you ask a question, you see it thinking, and there's a couple of seconds there of it processing, and then it spits out an answer. Well, that's great for today. That is revolutionary compared to where the concepts of neural networks and AI was, a decade or 2 decades ago. But if you think about how quickly things are evolving, the expectation is going to be that that answer happens in the blink of an eye, right? And not just for the sake of a conversation or asking a question, but it's going to be that AI is going to get into its second phase of not just duplicating things that could be done by humans, but how do you provide these new experiences? And those new experiences rely on hyperlocal and hyper-trusted real-time interactions.
And I get the sense that it's not simply processing in the AI algorithms that you want to distribute to get really trustworthy, hyperlocal, and fast answers. There must be an element in this architecture of staging the correct data locally also, even though that might be from a central repository of all taxpayers or all people with a global entry card or whatever it might be, that you have to have selected data local, which gets to be a little more complicated.
Yeah, absolutely. And so there's definitely part of like having the right set of technologies at the right time, right? And so there are use cases still today for centralizing systems completely. But as the world continues to evolve and databases and the way we process data can be secured and managed more effectively to also take into account the kind of the data sovereignty rules of any given country, right? I may be a US citizen traveling overseas, needing access to certain information in a particular country. Well, what does that mean for me over there? And so there's a lot of things where I want to be able to, especially if I'm an agency who's globally distributed or has people that are traveling all over the world, be able to process my information in a way that adheres to US laws and follows a FedRAMP standard, right? And know that there's nobody else that's spying on that information or making the infrastructure that I'm relying on vulnerable.
Sure, not to get too detailed, but very often the data doesn't have to be there forever. In the flight example, there's now facial recognition that identifies you at the beginning and the end of, say, an overseas journey.
Yeah.
And customs is a facial recognition clearance issue. But once you're through, they know you're here, it knows, the system knows, and then that data is gone.
Yep.
Because there's another 300 people coming in 10 minutes later, and so on. So the architecture includes a time and place element as well as a data element?
Yeah, correct. I think the privacy and trust ultimately is the thing that agencies have to be able to solve for first, right? Whether it's the message of the administration, whether it's an IT system that's going to provide this new service, but also may make people feel uncomfortable, right? Taking a picture, even if it is temporary, do they trust that it is temporary, right? How do you provide that transparency? And so I think if you think about what the industry is providing from a kind of distributed architectures perspective and platforms that have been around and been able to build trust, not just with the technology stack, but the things that they've done for industry, right? So how are people ensuring that the privacy of everyone, whether it's an individual, a large organization, is protected? And those type of things really make a big difference in building that public trust. And once you have that public trust, then you can start thinking about how do you provide experiences that go beyond the basics that we're able to provide today.
Sure. All right, so agencies are getting into this era, large organizations, and right now they're basically in phase 2 of cloud, you might say, second generation. They have hyper scaled and containerized workloads that were developed for the cloud for the most part. You have hybrid environments. What do they need to do to prepare for this distributed new architecture for the new types of services you've described? What do they got to do now?
So I think there's really 2 things that we focus on. You have to start building for where the users are, wherever they are, and adjust to that user's expectations, right? And so really this comes about in 2 ways. First is you have to rethink how you're going about building that new application for the next generation of services that aren't even fully built yet. And what that means is, we used to build software as a monolithic stack. Everybody knows over the last decade, maybe a little bit longer, we've gone to this like microservices architecture. And so you could kind of compartmentalize the pieces of a system that needed to be reworked or modernized or upgraded for security posture. And you could do that and still allow the system to be resilient, right? But it was still generally a centralized system. Or if it was distributed, it was on the agency and the IT folks to come figure out a way to distribute that application, have a DR strategy, et cetera. And so if you're doing that manually, it's still a highly complicated process, and you still have this scenario where it becomes overwhelming for the IT organization to provide service. In the next generation of services, through folks like Cloudflare, but there's many others, right, that have built hyper-distributed networks, you can now build your applications where it's build once and distribute everywhere at the same time, all over the place, and you don't have to think about it, right? So the same way that moving from a physical data center to a public cloud meant that agencies didn't have to think about the kind of the guts of how to do cabling and power management, et cetera. You're essentially now offloading the capabilities of that application infrastructure and services to vendors who are designed to essentially distribute this across the globe.
All right, so how does that work in terms of, well, the hardware? Because when you are in a cloud, there's a building with hardware in it. If you distribute it, it's distributed to many, many different clouds that are closer to the local user. It's not local, like in people's devices.
Yeah, so I think at Cloudflare, the mission of the company is to help build a better internet. And so that takes a lot of forms. The key word there is help, right? There's no one company that's going to own the whole of the internet. And so if you think about what made the internet, it was the ability to interoperate with whatever was on the other side, right? Through a common protocol. And so I think that's a large part of how we make this work. Is it doesn't matter where you want to host your services, whether it's on a particular platform that you're using today or a new platform. The thing that you really have to think about is even if that platform provides what you need today or what you think it's going to provide over the next couple of years, right? How are you building that to be close to your end user as possible? That's ultimately the thing that has to drive the direction of the application development.
Right, and the cloud industry development has allowed this in the sense because we're 2 or 3 clouds of a given vendor. Now they've got dozens in all geographies.
Yeah, and so it's not even just dozens across, you have multiple types of services, right? So you have the CSPs, the hyperscalers that have major data centers across the globe. When we think about the federal environment in particular, there is somewhat of a challenge there, right? And it's that, well, all the data centers and all the services are not FedRAMP compliant. And so then all of a sudden you went from having this massive network that was available on the commercial side to now having this somewhat centralized system. You still went from having hundreds of data centers down to maybe a dozen or a handful. And so newer generations of services that don't have the technical debt of being around for 20, 30 years have been able, like Cloudflare, have been able to build architectures that are just building the FedRAMP standards into the architecture. Whether you're commercial or FedRAMP, it doesn't matter, the same concepts apply. And that homogeneous nature of the architecture means that the federal user doesn't have to be treated as a second-class citizen, right? It's not that, well, if you do it on the commercial side, you have these capabilities. If you do it on the federal side, you have a subset of those capabilities. You, again, as the mission of a company that says we want to help build a better internet, it's upon us to ensure that everybody gets the same internet, right?
So in other words, all instances of this distributed application, if you will, inherit the FedRAMP compliance of the original.
Yes, correct. And so then that means if there's new services that are offered, new capabilities, and you need to extend the services to be tightly controlled in a particular way to a particular geography, you have the full control to be able to do that. And where that becomes critical is, again, back to the public trust, right? You may have certain areas where certain applications that you just want distributed everywhere and you need it to just be available for the user as fast as possible. And you may have some cases where it makes more sense for it to be highly centralized in a particular way, and being able to route that effectively, get it to the right location as fast as possible. You can imagine in cases of like veterans who need help with benefits or something like that, and they're in a local clinic, right? Well, you want to make sure that experience, regardless of the Wi-Fi they may have or the device they may have, is still secure, but performant so that they can get through the process.
Sure, I imagine it gives you a load balancing quality also.
The analogy I'd use here is that think of us like a smartphone, but for your government IT. So if you think about 15 years ago, 20 years ago, or maybe longer, I guess, whatever the flip phone was around versus the smartphone, right? If you were traveling for a work event and you needed to take a flip phone, you needed a GPS in your car, you needed something to take notes on, a camera to take a photo with, you had a bunch of these devices. And then essentially a smartphone turned all those things into applications, right? So that same concept is what Cloudflare is bringing to kind of the enterprise IT space for networking and security. If you think about whether it's load balancing or firewalls or denial of service protections and web application firewalls for your web apps, all those things don't have to be individual components tied to the hardware that you were talking about earlier, right? It could just be apps on a phone effectively. And so if you have this operating system that's running globally, and you can take all these kind of critical network services, the security services and developer services, and just make them apps on a phone, then you effectively have what Cloudflare has built for the agencies.
And maybe just give us a sense of what precisely someone buying into Cloudflare is obtaining. Is it a development environment? Is it a network? Or what is it exactly?
At its most core, I'd say Cloudflare is a distributed global network that is a platform for you to develop on, right? And so the simplest way, if you're explaining it to your mother, would be anything that's connected to the internet. Cloudflare helps you protect it, secure it, and make it more performant for you to access the services on the internet.
Yeah, we touched on the security briefly in saying that the FedRAMP qualities go with the instances of the application. What are the security considerations that people should keep in mind also when doing this approach, this new architecture?
Yeah. So again, back to the public trust, people are generally open to sharing information on the internet, probably more so than they even should, right? And so one of the things that Cloudflare 14, 15 years ago became known for is we took the concept of HTTP. If you remember, back in the day, you could just go to HTTP, even if you were doing a credit card transaction, and that meant everything was over plain text. Cloudflare made the concept of SSL certificates and making sites HTTPS free and easy for anybody to use, whether you were a large enterprise who had a staff of people who knew that process but didn't want to deal with the manual complexities, or you're an individual user who was just standing up a site on their own. Today, if you think about where the world has evolved to, well, yes, you still need SSL protections and HTTPS, but really the next evolution here is post-quantum crypto, right? And everyone knows that it's right around the corner. And so how do you start preparing now to ensure that that next generation of kind of hackers is not able to kind of steal your data now, harvest that later, right? So the protections here need to be designed in a way where they're just as simple as possible for people to deploy. I think that's a large part of the concepts of what Cloudflare has deployed across the globe for users, whether you're an individual user, a small business, or a large enterprise. We really take complicated things and make them less complicated, right? It's in IT, so I hate using the word simple because nothing in IT is simple. But if you think about these manual tasks that take a lot of effort and kind of thought and complexity to get right, if you could just toggle those things on and raise the floor for everybody, it raises the security posture of the entire internet. And that means when you're developing for a distributed application or a centralized application, whatever it might be, you're no longer having to make this compromise between security and performance, right? The security is baked in. Again, these are tropes that have been around forever. And so the concepts aren't new. It's just that how you execute those in a way that is actually simple for users is possible today, whereas 20 years ago, we didn't have all the components needed across the internet to make that ecosystem actually work that smoothly.
And are there any examples, agencies you can name or at least describe that are into this new era?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different examples that I can give there. The first I'll share would be CISA, if you're familiar with the Einstein program that's been around at CISA for a number of decades now. The latest version of that is referred to as protective DNS, and part of that program, Cloudflare provides essentially secure web gateway functionality for all of the federal civilian executive branch agencies. And what that means is any government employee that's going out to a site that maybe mistypes a URL and goes to something that they shouldn't, that information we help protect the agencies and employees from. The larger kind of platform play, right, is we have agencies, cabinet level agencies that have gone all in on Cloudflare. And so, we've talked today about a couple of different stacks as we look at the evolution of where the internet is going, where data centers are going, where networks are going. And so if we think about how do you secure that, how do you connect to the services that you need to connect to wherever they might reside and whatever clouds they might reside in, and then how do you develop for that next generation of distributed applications? Well, there's a lot of vendors that can provide any one of those silos. There's a couple of vendors that can provide maybe some of the things across many of those silos. The key is that if you're making all that work, the integrations is the hard part, right? So how do you make all those silos work together and still give span of control to the groups that need it within a particular agency? And that's the complexity that Cloudflare has solved.
All right, well, hope some people will take you up on that, some more people. I want to thank you for being with us today. My guest has been Anish Patel. He's the head of Federal at Cloudflare. I'm Tom Temin. You're watching Federal News Network. Let's go back to the studio now for more on the Industry Exchange Cloud.